March 17, 1815. Athlone Garrison, County Westmeath, Ireland. When Private James Dunworth collapsed in the barracks courtyard, the military surgeon initially attributed his death to heart failure. A young man, barely 23 years old, struck down in the prime of his service. The cause seemed clear enough. Soldiers died from illness all the time in His Majesty's forces. But then someone noticed the monkey, the regimental drummer boy's pet capuchin, a creature named Wellington after the great general himself, sat in the corner of the courtyard. The animal was trembling violently, its small hands covering its eyes. When Sergeant Major Henry Blackwood approached the creature, it began to shriek, a sound witnesses would later describe as eerily human, almost like a child screaming in terror. The monkey refused to move from that spot for 3 days. It would eat nothing, accept comfort from no one. And whenever Captain Edmund Vickers passed by, Wellington would bare its teeth and howl with such intensity that even hardened soldiers stepped back in unease. The garrison's commanding officer ordered an investigation into what had truly happened to Private Dunworth. What they discovered in the following weeks would expose a systematic pattern of brutality hidden behind military discipline, witnessed by the one creature who could not be silenced through threats or intimidation. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Athlone Garrison drummer boy's monkey and the murder it witnessed, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We bring you the darkest, most forgotten chapters of history every week. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from today. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's step back into 1815 Ireland and discover how a military mascot became the key witness to murder. The year 1815 marked a pivotal moment in British military history. Napoleon Bonaparte had escaped from Elba in February, returning to France and raising an army with terrifying speed. Across the British Empire, garrisons scrambled to prepare for what would become the Waterloo Campaign. Every able-bodied soldier was precious. Every regiment needed to be ready for deployment at a moment's notice. Athlone Garrison sat on the banks of the River Shannon in the heart of Ireland, a strategic military installation that had guarded the crossing point for over a century. The massive stone fortress housed approximately 400 men from the 88th Regiment of Foot, known as the Connaught Rangers. These were hardened soldiers, many of whom had fought in the Peninsular War against Napoleon's forces in Spain and Portugal. Ireland in 1815 existed under complex tensions. The Act of Union had dissolved the Irish Parliament just 15 years earlier, folding Ireland directly into the United Kingdom. Resentment simmered beneath the surface of daily life. The Catholic majority remained barred from holding public office or serving as military officers. Poverty gripped the countryside. The British military presence represented both employment opportunity and occupation force, depending on one's perspective. Within this context, the Athlone Garrison functioned as a microcosm of strict hierarchical control. Officers were almost exclusively Protestant and often English-born. The rank-and-file soldiers came primarily from Irish Catholic families, men who joined the army because it offered regular meals and a shilling a day when farming offered only starvation. The gap between officer and enlisted man wasn't merely one of rank. It was one of class, religion, ethnicity, and power. Captain Edmund Vickers had commanded B Company of the 88th Regiment for 3 years. At 38 years old, he was the third son of a minor baronet from Hampshire. Military service represented his only viable path to income and status. His older brothers would inherit the family estate. Edmund had only his commission, purchased for him by his father for the sum of £30,500. Those who served under Vickers described him as a man of peculiar intensity. Tall and lean, with pale eyes that rarely blinked, he maintained an obsessive focus on military discipline. His uniform was always immaculate. His quarters were arranged with geometric precision. He required his men to stand at attention even when he passed them in casual circumstances outside of formal duty. Captain Vickers could find fault with a statue, wrote Lieutenant Thomas Morehouse in his personal diary, now held in the National Archives of Ireland. He inspected our company with such scrutiny that men would tremble at parade. A button slightly tarnished, a bootlace tied with the wrong knot. These infractions would send him into states of cold fury. The disciplinary tools available to British military officers in 1815 were brutal by modern standards but considered normal for the era. Flogging was the primary punishment for infractions. The cat o' nine tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords, could deliver up to 1,000 lashes for serious offenses, though most sentences ranged from 25 to 300 lashes. Medical officers occasionally intervened if a soldier appeared likely to die during punishment, but the practice was designed to be severe enough to maintain absolute control over men who outnumbered their officers substantially. What separated acceptable military discipline from sadism was supposed to be military law itself. Flogging required formal court-martial proceedings for serious offenses. Officers could order summary punishment of up to 25 lashes for minor infractions, but even this required documentation and witnesses. The system was harsh but contained theoretical limits. Captain Vickers, however, appeared to view these regulations as obstacles rather than safeguards. Private James Dunworth joined the 88th Regiment in 1812 at the age of 20. He came from a farming family near Ballinasloe, the eldest of 6 children. His parents had lost their land lease to an English landlord, and James enlisted to send money home to his mother and siblings. His service record shows a competent, unremarkable soldier, neither exemplary nor problematic. He could read and write, unusual for an enlisted man of his background. He served as company clerk, managing B Company's paperwork under Captain Vickers' supervision. This administrative role brought Dunworth into daily contact with his commanding officer. He worked in an anteroom adjacent to Vickers' quarters, copying reports, maintaining duty rosters, and managing correspondence. It was a position that offered some shelter from the hardest physical labor of garrison life, but it also meant prolonged exposure to Vickers' exacting standards. The garrison's most unusual resident was 12-year-old Thomas Brennan, the regiment's drummer boy. Military units of the era employed boys as young as 10 as drummers and fifers. These children weren't mere mascots, they served crucial communication functions on battlefields, where drum patterns conveyed orders across the chaos of combat. Young Thomas had joined the regiment 2 years earlier, sponsored by his uncle, a sergeant in the Connaught Rangers. Thomas had brought with him an extraordinary companion, a capuchin monkey he'd named Wellington. The creature had been a gift from a Portuguese merchant during the regiment's service in Lisbon. Capuchin monkeys were popular exotic pets among those who could afford them, prized for their intelligence and ability to learn tricks. Wellington stood approximately 18 inches tall, with brown fur and an expressive face that seemed almost human in its range of emotion. The monkey became an unofficial mascot for the regiment. Soldiers would share bits of their rations with Wellington. The creature learned to salute when officers passed, a trick that never failed to amuse the men. Thomas had fashioned a tiny uniform jacket for Wellington, complete with regimental colors. The monkey would sometimes accompany the drummer during morning parade, perched on Thomas's shoulder, its small hands gripping the boy's coat. Wellington had more intelligence than some of the soldiers, recalled Corporal Patrick O'Malley in testimony given later. The creature understood routines, knew when meals were coming, would hide when it sensed punishment was about to be administered. I once saw it comfort young Thomas when the boy was weeping after a harsh reprimand. The monkey brought him a crust of bread and patted his shoulder. Uncanny thing to witness. Animals in military garrisons weren't unusual. Regiments kept horses, obviously, and many soldiers maintained dogs, but Wellington occupied a unique position. The monkey moved freely through the garrison, climbing walls, perching in windows, observing the daily rhythms of military life with what seemed like genuine interest. The creature appeared to recognize individual soldiers, showing affection to some and avoiding others entirely. Captain Vickers tolerated Wellington's presence but showed no affection for the animal. Several soldiers noted that the monkey would never approach Vickers voluntarily. When the captain passed through an area where Wellington was present, the monkey would retreat to a high perch and watch him with what witnesses described as unusual intensity for an animal. The winter of 1814 to 1815 brought particularly harsh conditions to Ireland. The Shannon flooded its banks in December. Food supplies to the garrison became irregular. The men endured cold, dampness, and monotony. Morale suffered. Disciplinary incidents increased. Captain Vickers responded by intensifying his enforcement of regulations. Inspections became more frequent and more severe. Punishment parades occurred weekly. The captain began documenting infractions in a personal ledger, separate from official company records, a detail that would later prove significant. In January 1815, Private Dunworth made his first documented mistake in Captain Vickers' service. He had copied a supply requisition incorrectly, transposing numbers that resulted in the company requesting 80 pounds of salt beef when they needed 800 pounds. The error was caught before the requisition was submitted, but Vickers ordered Dunworth to receive 15 lashes for gross negligence in clerical duties. This punishment was unusual. Clerical errors typically resulted in extra duty or confinement to barracks, not corporal punishment. Several officers noted their surprise, but no one challenged Captain Vickers' authority. The punishment was carried out in the company courtyard. Dunworth received his 15 lashes without crying out, as was expected of soldiers wishing to maintain dignity before their comrades. What witnesses remembered most clearly was Wellington's reaction. The monkey had been perched in a window overlooking the courtyard. When the flogging began, Wellington began to shriek and attempt to escape through the window bars. Thomas had to retrieve the creature and confine it to their quarters. For the rest of that day, Wellington refused to leave the drummer boy's small room, cowering under the bed and whimpering whenever footsteps passed in the corridor. February brought the news of Napoleon's escape from Elba. The garrison prepared for possible deployment to the continent. Training intensified. Officers drilled their companies relentlessly. The pressure of impending combat operations affected everyone, from the commanding colonel down to the newest private. Private Dunworth's work responsibilities increased. Captain Vickers demanded perfection in all paperwork related to the company's readiness reports. Dunworth worked long hours in the anteroom, often late into the night by candlelight, reviewing and recopying documents to meet Vickers' standards. Other soldiers in B Company began to notice changes in Dunworth's demeanor. He grew quiet and withdrawn. He developed a slight tremor in his hands. He started at sudden noises. Corporal O'Malley later testified that Dunworth had lost a noticeable amount of weight, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. James stopped joining us for cards in the evening, O'Malley recalled. He'd been a sociable lad before, had a good singing voice, would lead us in songs sometimes, but that winter he became like a ghost, present but absent, if you understand me. When you spoke to him, he'd startle like you'd shouted, even if you'd addressed him gentle-like. The garrison's military surgeon, Dr. Lionel Pemberton, noted in his medical log that he'd treated Dunworth twice in February for nervous complaints and difficulty sleeping. The doctor prescribed a tonic containing laudanum and advised Dunworth to take more exercise and fresh air. This was standard medical practice for the era, which understood little about psychological trauma or anxiety disorders. Young Thomas Brennan later provided crucial testimony about this period. The drummer boys' quarters were located near Captain Vickers' offices. Through the thin walls of the old garrison buildings, Thomas could hear raised voices from the captain's rooms on multiple occasions during February and early March. I couldn't make out the words exactly, Thomas told investigators, but I knew Private Dunworth's voice and I knew the captain's. The captain's voice was always controlled, always level, but somehow that made it more frightening, like ice cracking, and I'd hear Dunworth responding, his voice strained like he was struggling to keep composure. This happened many times. Wellington would always react. The monkey would pace and chatter when those conversations occurred. Animals sense these things, I think. Sense danger. The psychological dynamic between Vickers and Dunworth appeared to evolve beyond the normal officer-subordinate relationship. Vickers began to summon Dunworth to his quarters at irregular hours, sometimes very late at night, to review paperwork or receive new assignments. This was unusual enough that other soldiers noticed and commented among themselves. The garrison operated on a foundation of rigid routine. Soldiers knew what to expect each day: morning parade, inspection, drill, meals at scheduled times, evening roll call. Officers maintained professional distance from enlisted men except during official duties. The intensity and irregularity of Vickers' attention to Dunworth violated these unwritten norms. What no one fully understood at the time was that Captain Vickers had identified in Private Dunworth something that triggered his deepest pathologies. Dunworth's literacy and clerical skills created a relationship of forced intimacy. The captain required Dunworth's services but appeared to resent this dependency. Dunworth had access to Vickers' correspondence, his personal records, his administrative decisions. This knowledge represented a form of power, however slight, and Vickers could not tolerate even the appearance of power in a subordinate. The garrison's social ecosystem enabled this dynamic. Officers of the era were largely unaccountable for how they treated enlisted men, as long as they maintained plausible deniability and observed the technical forms of military law. The rank-and-file soldiers had no meaningful recourse for complaints about officer conduct. To speak against an officer was itself an offense punishable by flogging. March arrived with the first hints of spring. Birds returned to the Shannon's banks. Days grew longer. The garrison received orders to prepare for potential deployment to Belgium, where British forces were massing against Napoleon's restored empire. Captain Vickers' behavior grew increasingly erratic, though erratic is perhaps the wrong word. It suggests randomness. What occurred was more precisely an intensification, a tightening spiral of control and punishment focused primarily on Private Dunworth. On March 10th, Dunworth received 25 lashes for insubordinate expression, after allegedly sighing audibly when given an assignment. On March 13th, he received another 20 lashes for slovenly dress, when a button on his coat was found to be loose. On March 15th, 15 lashes for being 3 minutes late to morning parade. Each of these punishments fell within Captain Vickers's authority to administer a summary punishment for minor offenses. Each was documented in the company punishment book. Each was technically legal under military regulations of the era. But the pattern was unmistakable. In the span of 5 days, Dunworth received 60 lashes total. His back had no time to heal between punishments. The company surgeon should have intervened on medical grounds, but Dr. Pemberton was treating wounded soldiers in another section of the garrison and was not present for these punishment formations. Wellington witnessed at least 2 of these floggings. Thomas Brennan tried to keep the monkey confined during punishment parades, but Wellington had learned to open the simple latch on the window shutter of their quarters. The creature would climb to its vantage point and watch, absolutely silent, its small hands gripping the window frame. Several soldiers remarked on the monkey's unusual behavior. Corporal O'Malley testified, "The creature watched like it understood what was happening, not with animal curiosity, but with something else. If I didn't know better, I'd say the monkey looked angry. It would stare at Captain Vickers during the floggings with its lips pulled back, showing teeth. When the captain would walk away afterward, Wellington would track him with its eyes until he was out of sight." On the evening of March 16th, the garrison held its regular officers' mess dinner. Captain Vickers attended, as was required. Fellow officers later reported that he seemed distracted, barely touching his food, drinking more wine than usual. When questioned about B Company's readiness for deployment, Vickers responded with uncharacteristic vagueness. Lieutenant Morehouse noted in his diary, "Edmund seemed elsewhere tonight. He excused himself early, claiming paperwork required his attention." This from a man who usually dominates conversation about regimental discipline and proper military bearing. Something is consuming him, though I cannot say what. What was consuming Captain Edmund Vickers was the complete psychological domination of Private James Dunworth. The historical evidence suggests that Vickers had become addicted to the exercise of power over this particular subordinate. Each punishment failed to satisfy. Each flogging created only temporary relief from whatever internal compulsion drove the captain. In the darkness of March 16th, Vickers summoned Dunworth to his quarters one final time. What happened in that room would only be partially reconstructed later, but the evidence suggests that Vickers confronted Dunworth about some new alleged infraction, possibly real, possibly imagined. Witnesses in adjacent rooms heard raised voices, then a crash, then silence. The next morning would bring the discovery that changed everything. But between the darkness of that night and the dawn's revelation, one small creature witnessed what human eyes did not see. Wellington had escaped young Thomas's quarters again. The monkey had climbed through its window and made its way across the garrison's walls. It perched outside Captain Vickers's quarters, drawn perhaps by the sound of voices, perhaps by something else, some animal instinct that sensed violence building like a storm. Through the window, Wellington watched as Captain Edmund Vickers crossed the line from brutal discipline into murder. March 17, 1815, began with the discovery of Private James Dunworth's body in the barracks courtyard. Corporal Michael Hennessy found him due. Ring the pre-dawn inspection walk. Dunworth lay face down on the cobblestones, his arms extended, his regimental coat soaked with blood. At first, Hennessy assumed a terrible accident. Perhaps Dunworth had fallen from one of the upper-story windows, though that wouldn't explain the blood pattern. Hennessy sounded the alarm. Within minutes, the duty officer, Lieutenant Thomas Morehouse, arrived at the scene. What he observed made him immediately send for the garrison surgeon and the commanding officer. Dr. Lionel Pemberton reached the courtyard within 10 minutes. His initial examination revealed that Dunworth had been dead for several hours, likely since the previous night. The body had already begun to grow cold and stiff, but the cause of death was not immediately apparent from external examination. "Turn him over," Dr. Pemberton ordered. When soldiers carefully turned the body face up, witnesses gasped. Dunworth's back was a mass of lacerations, far beyond what his recent documented punishments should have produced. The flesh had been flayed open in multiple places. The severity suggested not 25 lashes, not 50, but possibly hundreds of strikes with a whip or similar instrument. "Sweet merciful God," Lieutenant Morehouse whispered. He later wrote in his diary, "I have seen battlefield casualties, men torn apart by artillery, but there was something uniquely horrifying about Dunworth's back. This was not the chaos of combat. This was methodical, systematic, done by human hands with deliberate intent." Dr. Pemberton's medical log entry for March 17th provides clinical detail. Patient deceased. Examination reveals extensive tissue damage across the dorsal region. Lacerations consistent with flogging, but far exceeding any authorized punishment. Estimate between 200-300 strikes minimum. Several wounds show signs of older scarring, suggesting this was not a single incident but repeated trauma over time. Cause of death appears to be shock and blood loss, though I will conduct a more thorough examination. The garrison's commanding officer, Colonel Richard Ashworth, arrived shortly after sunrise. He viewed the body, conferred briefly with Dr. Pemberton, and immediately ordered the courtyard cleared and secured. He instructed Lieutenant Morehouse to compile a list of everyone who had been on duty the previous evening and night. This was when someone noticed the monkey. Wellington sat in the corner of the courtyard, approximately 15 feet from where Dunworth's body lay. The creature was completely motionless, an unusual state for the normally active capuchin. Its small hands covered its eyes in a gesture eerily reminiscent of human distress. Young Thomas Brennan was summoned. The drummer boy attempted to retrieve his pet, but Wellington refused to move. When Thomas tried to pick him up, the monkey screeched and bit the boy's hand, the first time Wellington had ever shown aggression toward his young owner. "Wellington, come now," Thomas pleaded, tears streaming down his face. The boy was traumatized by the scene, by the blood, by the death of a soldier he'd known. "Please, Wellington." The monkey remained frozen in place. It was Corporal O'Malley who noticed Wellington's gaze. "The creature's staring at something," O'Malley said. "Look at the direction." Wellington was indeed staring, its hands now lowered slightly, its eyes fixed on a specific point. Following the monkey's line of sight led to Captain Vickers' quarters on the second floor of the barracks building. At that exact moment, Captain Vickers emerged from his doorway and began descending the exterior stone staircase to the courtyard. The moment Vickers appeared, Wellington began to shriek. The sound was piercing, almost unbearable. The monkey bared its teeth and lunged in Vickers' direction, though it remained in its corner, seemingly unable or unwilling to fully approach the captain. Every soldier in the courtyard turned to stare. "Captain." Vickers froze on the staircase, his face draining of color. For perhaps 10 seconds, man and monkey locked eyes across the courtyard. Then Vickers regained his composure and continued down the stairs. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Vickers demanded, his voice controlled but strained. "Why has morning parade been disrupted?" Colonel Ashworth stepped forward. "Captain Vickers, Private Dunworth, has been found dead, under circumstances that require immediate investigation." Vickers approached the covered body. Soldiers parted to let him pass. Wellington's shrieks intensified. The monkey began throwing itself against the courtyard wall as if trying to attack Vickers, but held back by invisible restraints. "Control that creature," Vickers snapped. "This is a military matter, not a circus." "The monkey was Private Dunworth's friend," Thomas Brennan said quietly. "Animals grieve too, sir." Vickers glanced at the boy with cold eyes but said nothing more about Wellington. He viewed Dunworth's body briefly, his expression unreadable. "A terrible tragedy," he said. "The private must have been administering self-punishment in some fit of religious mania and taken it too far. I've read of such cases. Catholic guilt can drive men to extraordinary acts of penance." This explanation was immediately problematic. Self-flagellation, while practiced by some religious extremists, would leave a distinctly different wound pattern. Moreover, the idea that a soldier would flog himself to death in a military garrison courtyard stretched credibility to the breaking point. Colonel Ashworth did not accept this theory. "Dr. Pemberton, is such an explanation consistent with your findings?" The surgeon hesitated. Military surgeons occupied a delicate position. They were officers but also medical professionals, sometimes caught between duty to truth and duty to hierarchy. "The wounds are severe, Colonel, and the pattern is consistent, with being administered by another person, not self-inflicted. Self-flagellation typically affects the shoulders and upper back primarily. These wounds extend from neck to waist in a pattern suggesting the victim was restrained and unable to move away." "Preposterous," Vickers said sharply. "Are you suggesting someone in this garrison committed murder?" "I am suggesting," Dr. Pemberton replied carefully, "that we must investigate thoroughly before drawing conclusions." Colonel Ashworth made a decision that would prove crucial. "Captain Vickers, I must ask you to confine yourself to quarters pending investigation. This is not an accusation, but a precautionary measure. As Private Dunworth served directly under you, and given the unusual circumstances, I believe this is appropriate." Vickers' jaw tightened. For a moment it appeared he might protest. Then he saluted stiffly. "As you order, Colonel." He turned and walked back toward the stairs. As he passed Wellington's corner, the monkey launched itself at him. The creature covered perhaps 6 feet in a single leap, claws extended, teeth bared. Only the quick reflexes of Corporal O'Malley saved Captain Vickers from injury. O'Malley intercepted the monkey mid-air, receiving several scratches across his arms as he wrestled Wellington into submission. "Lock that beast away," Vickers commanded, his composure finally cracking. There was something in his voice, not anger exactly, but fear. It's gone mad. It should be destroyed. Wellington's never done anything like this, Thomas protested. Never. He's gentle as a lamb usually. Something's terrified him, sir. Something's... Silence, Colonel Ashworth commanded. He turned to Thomas. Take your monkey to your quarters and secure him there. Now. Thomas gathered the trembling Wellington into his arms. The monkey buried its face against the boy's chest, whimpering. As Thomas carried him away, Wellington kept its eyes fixed on Captain Vickers until they were out of sight. The investigation began in earnest. That afternoon, Colonel Ashworth appointed a board of inquiry consisting of himself, 2 senior captains from other companies, Dr. Pemberton, and the garrison's adjutant. They interviewed dozens of soldiers and officers. A pattern emerged quickly. Multiple witnesses reported hearing sounds from Captain Vickers' quarters the previous night, voices raised in argument, then sounds of impact, then silence. Several soldiers who bunked in rooms adjacent to Vickers' quarters provided testimony. Private William Crawford stated, I heard Captain Vickers shouting, which was unusual. He normally keeps his voice very controlled. He was saying something about insolence and learning respect. Then I heard what sounded like furniture breaking. Then rhythmic sounds like someone beating a rug, but heavier. This continued for perhaps 10 minutes. Then nothing. Private Joseph Kelly testified, I heard Dunworth begging. I couldn't make out all the words, but I clearly heard him say please sir and I'm sorry sir multiple times. Then the begging stopped, but the beating sounds continued. These testimonies painted a damning picture. The Board of Inquiry requested permission to search Captain Vickers' quarters. Colonel Ashworth granted it immediately. What they found provided physical evidence that corroborated the witness accounts. In Vickers' private rooms, investigators discovered a cat o' nine tails, still damp with blood, hidden in a wardrobe, blood spatter on the floor and walls. Partially cleaned, but still visible, a broken chair. Apparently smashed during a struggle. Dunworth's clerk ledger, lying open on a desk, with several pages torn out, a personal journal kept by Vickers. Locked in a drawer, the journal proved to be the most revealing evidence. Written in Vickers' precise handwriting, it contained months of entries documenting his growing obsession with correcting the insolence of Private Dunworth. The entries became increasingly disturbed as they progressed. A sampling of entries, January 30th, 1815. Dunworth fails to show proper deference. He performs his duties adequately but lacks the fear necessary for proper subordination. I sense defiance beneath his obedient exterior. This must be addressed. February 14th, 1815, 15 lashes today. He bore it without crying out. This concerns me. A proper soldier should show pain, should demonstrate that punishment has effect. His stoicism suggests hidden strength, perhaps hidden contempt. I will watch him more carefully. February 28th, 1815, Dunworth looked at me today with what I interpreted as pity. Pity, from a common private toward his commanding officer. This cannot stand. He must be taught absolute submission. The regulations are too lenient. True discipline requires more. March 15th, 1815, the official punishments accomplish nothing. He endures them and returns to his duties as if nothing has occurred. Tonight I will ensure he understands his position. The others need not know. Military justice sometimes requires measures beyond official sanction, for the good of discipline, for the maintenance of proper order. The final entry was dated March 16th, 1815. Tonight I will break him completely. He will beg. He will weep. He will acknowledge my absolute authority. Only then will order be properly restored. Dr. Pemberton conducted a complete autopsy of Dunworth's body. His official report, preserved in military archives, provides gruesome detail. Deceased shows evidence of extensive trauma to the dorsal region. Approximately 247 individual lash marks can be counted, layered over older scarring from previous floggings. Several lacerations penetrated to the muscle tissue. Evidence of broken ribs, likely from impacts against a hard surface while being restrained. Cause of death determined to be cardiac arrest induced by extreme pain and shock, complicated by massive blood loss. Time of death estimated between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. on March 16th. Based on the severity and pattern of injuries, death occurred during or immediately following the infliction of these wounds. His shoulder, unusually subdued. When Vickers passed within 20 feet of them, the monkey let out a single piercing shriek, then fell silent again. The investigation board spent the following week compiling evidence and taking depositions. They uncovered additional disturbing information about Captain Vickers' conduct over the previous months. Several privates came forward to report incidents they'd previously been too frightened to mention. Private Lawrence Murphy testified that Vickers had ordered him to receive 30 lashes for impudent speech, after Murphy had asked permission to visit his dying father. Private Hugh Flanagan reported receiving 25 lashes for having muddy boots after completing work detail in the rain. Private Edward Quinn had been flogged for slow obedience when he'd taken 3 seconds to respond to an order rather than 2. A pattern of systematic abuse emerged. Vickers had created a climate of terror within B Company. Soldiers learned to avoid his attention entirely, to speak only when spoken to anticipate his requirements before he voiced them. The company's official punishment log showed 3 times as many flogging incidents as any other company in the regiment. But Private Dunworth had been different. His clerical position made him impossible to avoid. Vickers' pathology had focused on Dunworth with laser intensity, escalating from harsh discipline to outright torture to, finally, murder. Dr. Pemberton's detailed medical examination of Dunworth's body revealed something else significant. The private had been malnourished in the months before his death, despite the garrison providing adequate rations. This suggested Vickers might have been restricting Dunworth's food as an additional punishment, a practice that left no visible marks and could be easily concealed. The physical evidence from Vickers' quarters was damning enough, but the psychological evidence from his journal was perhaps even more revealing. Additional entries, examined more thoroughly, showed a man descending into obsessive paranoia. One entry from early March read, "Dunworth knows too much. He handles all my correspondence, sees my private papers, reads my orders before they're issued. He could destroy me with a word to the wrong person. I see knowledge in his eyes. Dangerous knowledge. He must be rendered incapable of using it." This was objectively delusional thinking. Dunworth had no power over Vickers. He was a private performing assigned clerical duties. He had no means to destroy a captain, no access to anyone who would believe a subordinate's word over an officer's. But Vickers had constructed a mental narrative in which Dunworth represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. Psychologists today would recognize elements of paranoid personality disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and sadistic personality disorder in Vickers's writings. But in 1815, such diagnostic categories didn't exist. The military authorities could only judge Vickers's actions, not his mental state by modern standards. On March 24th, another crucial piece of evidence emerged. A private from a different company came forward with information he'd been hesitant to share. Private Geoffrey Walsh had served with the 88th Regiment during the Peninsular War. He testified that Captain Vickers had been investigated once before in 1813 for excessive punishment of soldiers under his command in Spain. 3 men died within a month, Walsh reported, all from B Company. All had been flogged multiple times under Captain Vickers's orders. The investigating officer at the time ruled the deaths were from disease and battle fatigue, not from punishment. But there were rumors. Men said Vickers had a taste for the lash, said he enjoyed watching men suffer. This testimony suggested that Dunworth's murder wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of progressively worsening behavior. The military system had failed to stop Vickers earlier, possibly because he maintained plausible deniability, possibly because officers protected one another, possibly because 3 dead Irish privates in a war zone simply didn't matter enough to prompt serious investigation. The role of Wellington, the capuchin monkey, became a subject of intense discussion among the officers conducting the investigation. While the animal obviously couldn't testify, its behavior provided crucial corroboration of the timeline and location of the murder. Lieutenant Morehouse wrote in his diary, "The creature's reactions are too consistent and specific to be coincidental. Wellington shows terror only in Vickers's presence. The monkey was demonstrably outside Vickers's window at the approximate time of Dunworth's death. Animals do not lie. They do not calculate or deceive. Wellington's testimony, if we can call it that, is perhaps the most reliable we have." Colonel Ashworth made a controversial decision. He ordered that Wellington be kept in the garrison and cared for until after the court-martial. The monkey would be present during proceedings. The board wanted Vickers to see the creature that had witnessed his crime, and they wanted to observe his reactions. This decision outraged Vickers when he learned of it. From his cell, he sent a written protest to Colonel Ashworth. "This is an absurdity beneath the dignity of military justice. I am to be confronted by a monkey. This animal is a beast, nothing more. Its presence in legal proceedings is a mockery of law and reason. I demand this creature be removed from the garrison immediately." Colonel Ashworth denied the request. The evidence compilation was completed by March 28th. The case against Captain Edmund Vickers included witness testimony from multiple soldiers hearing Dunworth being beaten in Vickers's quarters, physical evidence, the blood-stained cat-o'-nine tails, Blood spatter in Vickers's rooms. Vickers' personal journal documenting his obsession with Dunworth. Dr. Pemberton's autopsy report definitively establishing cause of death. Historical pattern of excessive punishment, administered by Vickers' circumstantial evidence from Wellington's behavior and presence at the scene. A court-martial date was set for April 15, 1815. Captain Edmund Vickers would face a panel of 5 senior officers who would determine his guilt or innocence, and if guilty, his sentence. In British military law of the era, the penalty for murder was death by hanging. The court-martial of Captain Edmund Vickers began on April 15, 1815, in the garrison's assembly hall. The proceedings were closed to enlisted men but attended by all available officers of the 88th Regiment and representatives from other units stationed in Ireland. The court-martial board consisted of 1 colonel and 4 lieutenant colonels, all senior officers with extensive service records. They sat behind a long table at the front of the hall. Captain Vickers sat to their left, flanked by 2 guards. A military lawyer from Dublin had been appointed to represent him, though Vickers had initially refused counsel, insisting he would defend himself. The judge advocate, a Major Harrison who specialized in military legal proceedings, presented the case for the prosecution. His opening statement was clinical and devastating. Gentlemen of the board, the evidence will show that Captain Edmund Vickers did willfully and with malicious intent torture Private James Dunworth to death on the night of March 16, 1815. This was not discipline. This was not punishment within the bounds of military regulations. This was murder, pure and simple, dressed in the disguise of military authority. The prosecution called witnesses in systematic order. First came the soldiers who had heard the sounds of Dunworth being beaten. Then the guards who had observed Vickers carrying a heavy bundle to the courtyard. Then Dr. Pemberton with his medical testimony. Vickers' defense lawyer, Captain George Fenimore, cross-examined each witness but made little headway. The testimony was too consistent, too detailed, too damning. The presentation of Vickers' journal caused a sensation in the courtroom. Major Harrison read selected entries aloud. Officers who had served alongside Vickers for years heard, for the first time, the true thoughts of a man they'd believed they knew. The journal revealed not a stern but fair disciplinarian, but a sadist consumed by paranoid obsessions. On the 3rd day of the trial, Thomas Brennan was called as a witness. The 12-year-old drummer boy stood before the board of senior officers, visibly trembling. Wellington sat on Thomas's shoulder, unusually still, its dark eyes scanning the room. "Young man," Major Harrison said gently, "please tell the board what you observed on the night of March 16th. Thomas took a breath. "Wellington got out of our quarters, sir. He does that sometimes. He's clever with latches. I noticed he was gone around sunset. I searched for him and found him outside Captain Vickers' window. He was watching something inside, and he was making sounds I'd never heard him make before. Frightened sounds, angry sounds. What did you do?" "I tried to get him to come down, sir, but he wouldn't. He stayed there for a long time. I could hear voices from inside the captain's quarters shouting. Then sounds of hitting. Wellington was screeching. Finally, I managed to grab him and bring him back to our room. But he was different after that, terrified. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, just sat in the corner shaking." "And what was Wellington's reaction when he later encountered Captain Vickers?" "He attacked him, sir. Wellington has never attacked anyone in his whole life. He's a gentle creature. But when he saw Captain Vickers after Private Dunworth died, he went mad. Like he knew the captain had done something terrible." Captain Fenimore stood for cross-examination. "Master Brennan, isn't it true that monkeys are unpredictable animals? That they sometimes become aggressive without reason?" "No, sir," Thomas said firmly. "Wellington only acts aggressive around Captain Vickers, no one else, never." "But you cannot know what the monkey actually saw through the window, can you? You cannot know what it was thinking." Thomas looked directly at Captain Vickers for the first time. "I know what fear looks like, sir. And I know what Wellington saw scared him more than anything ever has. Animals don't lie about what they've seen." At this moment, in a detail recorded by multiple observers, Wellington began to chatter and point at Captain Vickers. The monkey's small hand extended, finger indicating the defendant with unmistakable intent. The creature then buried its face in Thomas's shoulder and whimpered. The courtroom fell silent. Several officers later reported that this moment affected them more powerfully than any human testimony. There was something primal and undeniable about the animal's reaction. Captain Vickers broke his silence for the first time. "This is absurd," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I am being condemned by the reactions of a beast, an animal with no more reasoning capacity than a dog or a horse. This is not justice, this is theater." The president of the board, Colonel Marcus Waverley, responded, "Captain Vickers, you will refrain from outbursts. The board will determine what evidence is relevant." The trial continued for 2 more days. Vickers' defense attempted to argue that Dunworth's death was accidental, that the private had requested extra punishment to atone for his errors, that the whole situation had spiraled out of control without murderous intent. But the evidence of premeditation, particularly the journal entries, made this defense untenable. On April 20th, the board retired to deliberate. They returned after only 90 minutes. "Captain Edmund Vickers," Colonel Waverley announced, "this board finds you guilty of murder of Private James Dunworth. You are hereby stripped of your commission and sentenced to death by hanging. Sentence to be carried out at dawn on April 25th, 1815. May God have mercy on your soul." Vickers showed no emotion. He stood rigidly at attention as the verdict was read, then allowed guards to escort him back to confinement. The execution was scheduled for 5 days later, but historical events intervened. On April 23rd, urgent dispatches arrived from London. Napoleon's forces were moving through Belgium. The Duke of Wellington, the actual general, not the monkey, required all available regiments to deploy to the continent immediately. The 88th Regiment received orders to march for transport ships within 48 hours. The execution date fell exactly in the middle of this window. Colonel Ashworth made a decision. The execution would proceed as scheduled. Military justice would not be delayed even for impending combat operations. Before dawn on April 25th, 1815, a gallows was erected in the garrison courtyard, the same courtyard where Dunworth's body had been discovered. The entire regiment formed in ranks to witness the execution, as was customary for such proceedings. Executions of officers were rare enough that this was considered a moment of profound significance. Edmund Vickers was led to the gallows in a prison uniform, his officer's coat having been ritually stripped from him following the verdict. He climbed the steps with mechanical precision, his military bearing intact even in his final moments. A military chaplain offered prayers. Vickers declined to make a final statement. The executioner placed the noose. At precisely 6:00 a.m., the trapdoor opened. Contemporary accounts note that Wellington was present, held by Thomas Brennan in the front rank of soldiers. When Vickers dropped, the monkey let out a single long cry that witnesses described as eerily human, almost like a wail of grief or perhaps vindication. Then Wellington fell silent and never showed any particular reaction to Vickers's memory again. The execution of Captain Edmund Vickers should have ended the matter, but it triggered unexpected consequences that rippled through the British military establishment. News of the case spread rapidly through military channels. Officers throughout the army learned that one of their own had been executed for murdering an enlisted man. This was almost unprecedented. The military hierarchy had always protected officers, understanding that maintaining absolute authority required shielding commanders from consequences for their actions towards subordinates. But something had shifted. The evidence in the Vickers case was too overwhelming, the brutality too extreme, the journal too damning. And perhaps most significantly, the public nature of the investigation and trial made covering up the incident impossible. The case prompted a review of corporal punishment regulations across the British Army. In June 1815, even as British forces were fighting at Waterloo, military administrators in London drafted new guidelines limiting the circumstances under which officers could order summary flogging. The maximum number of lashes for summary punishment was reduced from 50% to 25%. Officers who exceeded these limits now faced mandatory investigation. These reforms were modest by modern standards, but they represented a recognition that unchecked authority could lead to murder. Private Dunworth's death became a cautionary tale in officer training programs. Don't be like Vickers. Don't let discipline become cruelty. Don't let authority become tyranny. The 88th Regiment deployed to Belgium on April 26th, the day after Vickers's execution. They fought at Waterloo on June 18th with distinction, though 37 men from the regiment died in that battle. Young Thomas Brennan and Wellington were both present, the monkey reportedly remaining calm even amidst the chaos of combat, having apparently witnessed worse horror. Roars in the Athlone Garrison courtyard. Dr. Lionel Pemberton's medical career benefited from his role in the case. His thorough autopsy and unflinching testimony despite pressure from fellow officers earned him a reputation for integrity. He was later appointed as Chief Medical Officer for military forces in Ireland, a position he used to advocate for better treatment of enlisted men and improved medical care for soldiers. Colonel Richard Ashworth received both commendation and criticism for his handling of the case. Some superiors praised his commitment to justice. Others quietly suggested he had betrayed the officer class by pursuing charges against Vickers so aggressively. Ashworth retired from military service in 1816 and wrote a memoir that included a chapter on the Vickers case, though it was censored by military authorities and not published in full until 1847. Thomas Brennan continued as the regiment's drummer until he aged out of the position at 16. He kept Wellington throughout this time. The monkey became even more famous after the trial, recognized by soldiers throughout the British forces in Ireland as the monkey who witnessed a murder. Thomas reportedly refused several offers from wealthy civilians who wanted to purchase Wellington as a curiosity. When Thomas left military service in 1819, he took Wellington with him and returned to civilian life in Ireland. Records indicate he became a schoolteacher in County Galway. Wellington lived until 1824, an impressive age for a capuchin monkey of that era, and died peacefully in his sleep. Thomas buried him in the garden behind his cottage and planted an oak tree over the grave. The oak tree, remarkably, still stands today, though the cottage is long gone. A small brass plaque was installed in 1989 by the Galway Historical Society. Near this spot lies Wellington, a capuchin monkey whose witness to injustice helped bring a murderer to justice. As for Private James Dunworth, he was buried with military honors in the Garrison Cemetery at Athlone on March 21, 1815. His family was notified of his death but not initially told the full circumstances. His mother, Catherine Dunworth, later learned the truth and wrote a letter to the military authorities that survives in archives. "My son James was a good boy who served his country with honor. That he should die not in battle but at the hands of a madman wearing the same uniform breaks my heart beyond words. But I take some small comfort that justice was done. That the man who killed my James paid with his own life, that my boy's death was not dismissed or forgotten. Thank you for that much." The Dunworth family received James's back pay and a small pension, though it was not enough to save them from poverty. Two of James's younger brothers later enlisted in the British Army themselves, seeking the same economic security that had drawn James to service. The case established several legal precedents in British military law. It was cited in subsequent court-martial proceedings as evidence that even officers could be held accountable for extreme abuses of authority. It contributed to ongoing debates about corporal punishment that would continue throughout the 19th century and eventually lead to the abolition of flogging in the British military in 1881. The case of Captain Edmund Vickers and Private James Dunworth illuminates darker truths about military justice, authority, and the capacity for systematic abuse within hierarchical institutions. In the early 19th century, military discipline operated on principles that would be considered torture by modern standards. Flogging was routine. Physical punishment was the primary tool for maintaining order. Officers held nearly absolute power over the enlisted men under their command. The system was designed this way intentionally. Military effectiveness required unquestioning obedience, and obedience was enforced through fear of punishment. But systems built on fear and pain are inherently unstable. They attract individuals for whom inflicting suffering provides psychological gratification. They create environments where cruelty can be rationalized as necessity. They erode the humanity of both the punished and the punishers. Vickers was an extreme case, but he wasn't unique. Military records from the Napoleonic-era document hundreds of soldiers who died from complications of flogging. These deaths were typically attributed to underlying health conditions or disease, rather than to the punishment itself. The military establishment had strong incentives to avoid acknowledging that its disciplinary system was killing soldiers. What made the Vickers case different was the impossibility of denial. The evidence was too clear, the brutality too extreme, the premeditation too well documented. And perhaps most importantly, the case involved an officer murdering an enlisted man in peacetime, on British soil, Ireland being part of the United Kingdom at that time, with multiple witnesses, leaving a literal written confession in his journal. The military hierarchy couldn't protect Vickers without completely undermining its own claims to justice and legitimacy. If officers could torture subordinates to death with impunity, the entire system would lose even the pretense of fairness that made it sustainable. The reforms that followed the case were incremental but meaningful. The reduction in maximum summary punishment from 50 to 25 lashes saved lives. The requirement for documentation and oversight prevented some of the most extreme abuses. These weren't transformative changes. Flogging remained legal in the British military for another 66 years, but they represented recognition that unlimited authority could corrupt even military discipline. The case also highlighted the importance of institutional courage. Colonel Ashworth took significant personal and professional risk by pursuing charges against a fellow officer. Military culture emphasized solidarity among officers, the understanding that they must present a united front to maintain authority over enlisted men. By breaking this unwritten code, Ashworth made himself vulnerable to retaliation and ostracism. But he did it anyway, because the evidence demanded it, and because justice required it. His example demonstrated that even within hierarchical systems designed to protect authority, individuals can choose principle over self-interest. The role of Wellington, the capuchin monkey, adds a layer of complexity to the case that resonates beyond the specific incident. Animals as witnesses challenges fundamental assumptions about justice and evidence. Wellington couldn't testify in the legal sense. The monkey couldn't take an oath or be cross-examined or clarify ambiguities in its observations. But Wellington's reactions provided a form of truth that human testimony sometimes lacks. The creature had no motive to lie, no political interests, no career to protect. Its fear of Vickers was genuine and unambiguous. Its presence at the scene was documented. Its behavior after the murder was consistent and verifiable. The military court didn't officially base their verdict on Wellington's reactions. They based it on the physical evidence, the witness testimony, and Vickers's journal. But many observers later noted that the monkey's testimony, in its own way, was the most persuasive element of the case. It cut through the legal complexity and the military protocols to reveal a simple truth. Vickers had done something so terrible that even an animal recognized it as evil. This raises philosophical questions about the nature of moral witness. Can animals testify to injustice? Do their reactions carry ethical weight? Should their suffering matter in our legal and moral calculations? Modern animal rights advocates would argue yes, while traditional legal scholars would say such considerations are irrelevant to human justice. The Vickers case exists. In the ambiguous space between these positions, neither fully endorsing animal testimony nor completely dismissing it. The psychological dimensions of the case warrant examination as well. Vickers's journal entries reveal a man descending into paranoid obsession, constructing elaborate justifications for increasingly extreme behavior. He convinced himself that Dunworth represented a threat that needed to be eliminated through escalating punishment. This pattern, authority figure identifies subordinate as threatening, rationalizes abuse as necessary discipline, escalates to extremity, appears repeatedly throughout history. In military contexts, prison systems, institutional settings of all kinds, individuals invested with power sometimes develop pathological relationships with those under their control. The warning signs were present in Vickers's case: his excessive focus on discipline, his disproportionate punishment of minor infractions, his isolation of particular victims for special attention. But the military system of his era had no mechanisms for identifying or addressing these patterns before they culminated in murder. Modern military psychology and leadership training now include material on recognizing and preventing such abuses. The Vickers case is sometimes taught in military ethics courses as an example of what happens when authority is divorced from accountability. The broader historical context matters as well. The year 1815 represented a turning point in European history. Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo marked the end of an era of total war. The massive military establishments built during the Napoleonic Wars began to contract. Questions arose about the purpose and organization of peacetime armies. The Vickers case occurred in this transitional moment. It exposed contradictions in a military system designed for wartime operations but operating in peacetime conditions. The brutal discipline that might be rationalized during active combat operations seemed less justifiable when applied in a garrison in Ireland, where soldiers drilled but didn't fight. The case contributed to broader debates about military reform that would continue throughout the 19th century. These debates eventually produced significant changes: the abolition of flogging, the establishment of military justice systems with better procedural protections, the recognition that soldiers had some rights even within military hierarchy. Private Dunworth's death thus became part of a larger story about the slow, painful evolution of military institutions toward greater humanity. His life was lost, but his death contributed to changes that may have saved others from similar fates. Finally, the case reminds us that justice is not inevitable. It required specific individuals making specific choices. Colonel Ashworth choosing to investigate despite pressure to overlook the incident. Dr. Pemberton providing honest medical testimony despite potential career consequences. Junior officers and enlisted men finding the courage to testify against a superior officer. Even young Thomas Brennan insisting that his monkey's reactions mattered and meant something. Justice, particularly justice for the powerless against the powerful, requires institutional courage and individual integrity. The Vickers case succeeded as a prosecution because enough people chose truth over convenience, principle over self-preservation. That success was limited and incomplete. It didn't transform the military system overnight. It didn't prevent other abuses. But it established that even within institutions designed to concentrate and protect authority, there were limits. Officers could not torture subordinates to death with impunity. Murder would not be tolerated, even when committed by those in power against those subject to their authority. This was a small victory, but it mattered. And Private James Dunworth, who died terribly and alone except for a monkey at the window, was remembered. The Athlone Garrison drummer boy's monkey case remains one of the most unusual incidents in British military history. A capuchin named Wellington, through its reactions and presence, helped bring a murderer to justice when human systems nearly failed. What do you think drove Captain Vickers to escalate from harsh discipline to outright murder? Was this a case of individual pathology? Or did the military system of the era create conditions that enabled such abuses? Leave your theories in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, you might also be interested in the case of the Curragh Camp disappearances of 1847, another dark chapter in Irish military history. We'll be covering that in an upcoming video. Have you ever heard stories about animals witnessing crimes or unusual events? Some people believe animals perceive more than we give them credit for. Wellington certainly seemed to understand something terrible had occurred. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts on animal intelligence and moral awareness. This story reminds us that justice requires individuals willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult and dangerous. Colonel Ashworth risked his career to pursue the truth. Dr. Pemberton provided honest testimony despite pressure. Young Thomas insisted his monkey's reactions mattered. These choices made the difference between a murderer facing consequences and a crime being swept aside as merely harsh discipline. Subscribe to The Silent Abbey for more forgotten chapters of history like this one. We uncover the stories that textbooks overlook, the dark corners of the past that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the systems we build. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a new video. We upload every week, bringing you meticulously researched historical content that illuminates the shadows of the past. Share this video with anyone who loves true crime, military history, or unusual historical cases. The algorithm rewards engagement, and sharing helps these stories reach the people who will appreciate them most. Until next time, remember that history is written not just in official records and grand narratives, but in individual lives, small acts of courage, and sometimes in the reactions of a monkey who witnessed something no creature should have to see. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.